Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I am back and I've going to be continuing this series reading this wonderful book, Bryan Burroughs' Days of Rage. And so, of course, as the title for the stream denotes, this is the second chapter in the book, and it is named Negroes with Guns. And of course, this is the part which is Black Rage on the Road to Revolution is the subtitle. So that kind of gives you exactly what it's about. So without further ado, we'll just go ahead and get right into it. I hope everybody's having a wonderful Monday. So, yeah. The United States has a long history of political violence, from its birth in revolutionary battles to a bloody civil war to 2 centuries of occasional race riots, draft riots, and labor riots. Acts of political terrorism, at least until the past 25 years, have been comparatively rare. Before the modern era, the most significant was a series of bombings by an anarchist group that climaxed in the September 1920 attack on Wall Street. With the possible exception of the Ku Klux Klan, the United States until 1970 had never spawned any true kind of underground movement committed to terrorist acts. There are so many myths about the 1970s era underground. Mention today that an armed resistance movement sprang up in the months after My Lai, the Manson family, and Woodstock, and the most common response is something along the lines of, "Oh, wasn't that a bunch of hippies protesting the Vietnam War in the 60s?" This couldn't be more wrong. The radicals of the new underground weren't hippies, they weren't primarily interested in the war, and it wasn't the 1960s. The last years of that decade did see a rise in campus violence, it's true, but the first true protest bombing campaign by Sam Melville's group didn't arrive until mid-1969, and headline bombings didn't become widespread until 1970. And while Melville and his peers certainly embraced the counterculture, they were the furthest thing from hippies, who tended toward hedonism and pacifism. The young radicals who engaged in bombings and the assassination of policemen during the 1970s and early 1980s were, for the most part, deadly serious, hardcore leftists. Members of the Black Liberation Army read Mao as part of their mandatory daily political education classes. So this is kind of following a pattern that we've seen before, is that the true violence in any sort of revolution doesn't happen until after they have been given an inch and reforms have been implemented, which allows them some sort of latitude and leverage. An even more prevalent myth, however, is that the radical violence that commenced in 1970 was a protest against the Vietnam War. In fact, while members of this new underground were vehemently anti-war, the war itself was seldom their primary focus. "We related to the war in a purely opportunistic way," recalls Howard Machtinger, one of the Weather Underground's early leaders. "We were happy to draw new members who were anti-war, but this was never about the war." Yeah, of course not. They're anti-Vietnam War because they're pro-communism. This isn't that hard. What about the underground movement was truly about, or what the underground movement was truly about, was the plight of Black Americans. Every single underground group of the 1970s, with the notable exception of the Puerto Rican Fallon, was concerned first and foremost with the struggle of blacks against police brutality, racism, and government repression. While late in the decade, several groups expanded their worldview to protest events in South Africa and Central America, the Black cause remained the core motivation of almost every significant radical who emerged in violent activities during the 1970s. Helping out the blacks, fighting alongside them, that was the whole kit and caboodle, says Machtinger. That was all we were about. Race comes first, always first, says Elizabeth Fink, a radical attorney in Brooklyn who represented scores of underground figures. Yeah, Fink. Fink. No, you think? So, everything started with the Black Panthers. Black Panthers, sorry, not Panthers. The whole thrill of being with them. When you heard Huey Newton, you were blown away. The civil rights movement had turned bad, and these people were ready to fight. And yeah, the war. The country was turning into Nazi Germany. That's how we saw it. Do you have the guts to stand up? The underground did. And oh, the glamour of it. The glamour of dealing with the underground. They were my heroes. Stupid me. It was the revolution, baby. We were going to make a revolution. We were so deluded. The underground groups of the 1970s were a product of a kind of grungy bell-bottomed coda to the raucous protest marches and demonstrations of the 1960s. If the story of the civil rights and anti-war movements is an inspiring tale of American empowerment and moral conviction, the underground years represent a final dark chapter that can seem easier to ignore. To begin to understand it, one needs to understand the voices of Black anger, which began to be noticed during the 1950s. All of it, from the first marches in Alabama and Mississippi, all the way to the arrest of the last underground radical in 1985, began with the civil rights movement, a cause led by Black Americans. And what was true at its inception remained true through the 1960s and into the 70s era underground. Blacks, for the most part, led, and whites followed. It's an interesting dynamic. It was Black leaders who initiated the first Southern boycotts, Black leaders who led the sit-ins and gave the great speeches, Black leaders who, when other avenues appeared blocked, first called for violence and open rebellion. At the end of the 60s, it was violent Black rhetoric that galvanized the people who went underground. It started in 1954. By that point, American Blacks, especially those laboring under Jim Crow in the South, had been subjected to almost a century of oppression, police brutality, discrimination, disenfranchisement, and lynching. They were, by and large, second-class citizens living in poverty, denied access to the best jobs and schools, and subjected to intermittent atrocities, from the murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till in 1955 to that of the activist Medgar Evers 8 years later. While groups like the NAACP had been campaigning for equal rights for decades, the modern civil rights movement gained momentum with 1954's Brown v. Board of Education, the landmark Supreme Court decision that overturned school segregation. I'll just quickly say here, this is a hint of a blue pill. Burrough is a journalist by trade. When I have questioned other people who have read this book, they complained about his journalistic writing style, and they think that it reads like a press report. I actually quite like it for this. These sort of like crime procedurals, as long as the basic facts are correct. Like I don't mind a bit of narrative embellishment, especially when it comes for like exciting things like this. But it's interesting because obviously he's got a very liberal framing here. He seems like a lib. He's not a communist. He's not a radical. He's just a basic bitch, like white shit lib, essentially, who works as a journalist. A year later came the boycott of public buses in Montgomery, Alabama, a protest that vaulted a minister named Martin Luther King Jr. to national prominence. a group he formed with other ministers, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, emerged as an umbrella organization for Black protests. King's movement gained momentum during the fight to desegregate schools in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, and then burst into international consciousness with a series of sit-ins that began in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. A new medium, television, broadcast images of enraged Southern sheriffs dragging away Black protesters that mobilized an entire generation of white people, many of them college students, who would come to define the 1960s. Then came the Freedom Riders, Bull Connors snapping German shepherds in Birmingham, Alabama, the March on Washington, Selma. Along the way, the movement, in quotations, was born. I mean, it's funny how, like, any sort of social movement which achieves social change always uses and comes really on the back of technology. It's like new technology creates conditions that lets people see things in ways they didn't see before, which tells you exactly what the internet bodes for the future. Through it all, King famously counseled a Gandhian policy of nonviolent resistance as the surest way to overcome ingrained Southern racism. From the beginning, however, his hymns of peace were accompanied by a deeper, angrier, little-noticed bass line throbbing ominously in the background of the Civil Rights Symphony. This was the siren song of what many blacks termed self-defense, but which a generation of wary whites saw simply as a call to violence, to shotgun blasts in the night, to rioting, to black men rampaging through the streets of burning white homes and businesses. This music began softly, barely audible, in the late 1950s, then rose in volume through the early 1960s until becoming a full-throated chorus in 1966 and 1967. By 1968, it was a battle song. Self-defense became struggle, then resistance, then black power, then revolution and guerrilla warfare and death. In some ways, it was a very old song. Calls for black uprisings date at least to the slave revolts of Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey, and cries for black militancy and separatism surfaced as early as the late 1800s. Modern black militarism dates to the years before World War I, when shadowy groups such as the African Blood Brotherhood and later Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association advocated for the formation of paramilitary self-defense units. Garvey's Universal African Legions were rifle-toting pseudo-soldiers in Navy uniforms who marched through Harlem in the 1920s. These were fringe movements at best, barely noticed outside the black community. The notion of a violent struggle against white America received little currency during the 1950s. King's message was the only one most Americans, black and white alike, were able to hear. But the specter of racial violence was always there, and as the years wore on with little sign of the seismic changes and many blacks disbanded, the voices of militancy grew louder. Between 1959 and 1952, the torch of self-defense was passed between 5 consecutive black men and their acolytes. The first, and least remembered, was Robert F. Williams, head of the NAACP chapter in the KKK stronghold of Monroe, North Carolina. A grandson of slaves, Williams spent his early years working in Detroit factories, where he became a labor organizer. Returning home in 1955, he wasted little time confronting Monroe's white power structure, boycotting whites-only lunch counters, and demanding in vain that black children be allowed to use the town pool. After watching a Klansman force a black girl to dance at gunpoint, Williams formed the Black Armed Guard, arguing that armed self-reliance was necessary in the face of Klan terrorism. Its members were mostly NAACP men who started carrying guns. If the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution cannot be enforced in this social jungle called Dixie at this time, the Negroes must defend themselves, even if necessary to resort to violence, he once told reporters. Williams became an international figure during 1958's infamous kissing case. Two black boys, aged 7 and 9, had participated in a schoolyard kissing game in which a white Monroe girl gave one of the boys a peck on the cheek. The boys were arrested for molestation, jailed, beaten, and sent to a reform school. Interesting response. Williams led a defense effort that eventually included Eleanor Roosevelt, and after a British newspaper expose, demonstrations in Paris, Rome, and Vienna. In Rotterdam, the U.S. Embassy was stoned. Soon after the boys were released, Williams, in turn, emerged as a minor celebrity, feted by Northern progressives in Harlem and other black strongholds. Why Paris, Rome, and Vienna? Why Rotterdam? Interesting. And of course, it's a British newspaper expose as well. And Eleanor Roosevelt, too. Strange. All of these places. During and after the case, Williams gave newspaper interviews in which he openly advocated black self-defense. If the Klan attacked a black man in Monroe, he swore, there would be retribution. We must be willing to kill if necessary, he told one reporter. Alarmed, the NAACP suspended him. Williams was unrepentant. Then, in 1961, when Freedom Riders came to their area to register black voters, a white couple drove in an angry black crowd. Williams took the couple into his home, then briefly refused to let them leave, saying it would be unsafe. Afterward, prosecutors charged him with kidnapping. When Williams fled, the FBI issued a warrant charging him with unlawful interstate flight. With the help of radical friends in Harlem, he made his way to Canada and then to Cuba, becoming among the first, but far from the last, U.S. radical to be warmly welcomed by Castro. I mean, this is interesting. These little teeny patterns here that we see. Like, where else have we seen a crowd of people and a couple, or some people driving in a car, usually white people who have to drive into the crowd in order to escape? Like, is this not an image that we have seen many times before at this point? Very interesting. Although the other details of the case of this little anecdote case are interesting too. He's getting accused of kidnapping. I mean, ostensibly he's leading the crowd, so why is he giving the victims of the crowd shelter? It's very strange indeed. In Cuba, Williams became a one-man factory of anti-Americanism. It was there he wrote the book that became his legacy, Negroes with Guns, in which he argued that North Carolina authorities began protecting blacks only after they armed themselves. Between 1962 and 1965, Williams churned out a stream of bellicose writings, many in a self-published newspaper, The Crusader. Castro even gave him a free radio show broadcast into southern states called Radio Free Dixie. During the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, Williams called on black servicemen to engage in armed insurrection. Even at the height of his notoriety, however, he remained a marginal figure, familiar mostly to other radicals and the FBI. He all but disappeared after moving to China in 1965. The second, and vastly more influential, messenger of black militancy was a charismatic Harlem preacher named Malcolm Little, better known to history as Malcolm X. Unlike Williams and King and most other black leaders seen on American television, Malcolm was a native of cold northern slums, where blacks faced conditions every bit as daunting as those in the Jim Crow South: poverty, widespread unemployment, poor housing, and rampant police brutality. A black man arrested in Harlem in the 1960s could routinely expect a beating. When policemen killed a black citizen, there was rarely a successful prosecution. It was no accident that when underground groups began forming in 1970 and 1971, their targets were rarely slumlords or army barracks or politicians. They were almost always policemen. This antagonism between the cops and the black population is not new. Focusing on these issues, Malcolm X had an exponentially greater influence on blacks than on whites. This was in large part because he never seriously engaged with the Southern civil rights movement, always the primary focus of white interest. He spent much of his career performing in a rhetorical theater that few whites even knew was open. Yeah, of course. Of course. This is like, oh, hey, we just want what's justice and right for us, and then in the meantime, the radical faction, the radical wing, the actual Jacobin wing of this radical movement, if you want to put it that way, is getting ready for violence because they want to push the revolution further and farther and faster. Cody Bassett says, nice to catch live. Yes, Cody, thanks for showing up. Appreciate it. Focusing on these issues, Malcolm X had an exponentially greater influence on blacks than on whites. This was in large part because he never seriously engaged with the Southern civil rights movement. Oh, sorry. Already read that paragraph. Malcolm was born in Omaha in 1925, one of 8 children. His father, Earl, was a Baptist lay preacher and an ardent member of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. From an early age, Earl's sense of black pride and self-reliance was instilled in Malcolm. Legend holds that the Klan harassed Earl Little for his views and forced the family to flee Omaha. They settled in Lansing, Michigan in 1928. As Malcolm later told his story, he was among the better students at his junior high school, but became withdrawn after a teacher told him that his idea of becoming a lawyer was not a, and I quote, realistic goal for a nigger, end quote. After 8th grade, he moved to a half-sister's home in Boston. At 17, he fled to Harlem, where he became a street hustler, dealing drugs, robbing stores, and working as a pimp. In Boston, he began burglarizing the homes of wealthy whites. Arrested in 1946, he was sentenced to 8 to 10 years at the Charlestown State Prison. Like many blacks who would go underground in the 1970s, Malcolm was radicalized behind bars, poring over nationalist texts recommended by older inmates. It was his brother, Reginald, who drew him into an obscure sect called the Nation of Islam. The Nation had been founded in 1930 by a Detroit clothing salesman named Wallace D. Fard, who preached that blacks had ruled the earth 6,000 years ago until their destruction by a renegade black wizard named Yaqub, who then created the white man, the white devil in the Nation's mythos, that is to say, the Nation of Islam's mythos. Blacks, Fard prophesied, would destroy the white devil in a future apocalypse. Until his disappearance and presumed death in 1934, Fard imbued his disciples with a message of racial pride, economic equality, and personal discipline. Over the next 20 years, his protege, Elijah Muhammad, quietly built the Nation into a small but vocal group of clean-cut, impeccably dressed black separatists, including a paramilitary wing called the Fruit of Islam. Still, by 1952, when Malcolm emerged from prison, Muhammad had only a few hundred followers. Malcolm changed everything. 6'3", handsome, intense, and bursting with charisma, he instantly became Muhammad's protege. At a storefront mosque in Detroit, on street corners, and later in Chicago and Boston, Malcolm mesmerized black crowds. His sermons, while ostensibly religious, were ringing anthems of black empowerment, pride, and self-defense, concepts many blacks had never heard aired in public. The Muslims dressed neatly and forbade drugs and alcohol. A mosque typically featured a blackboard Islamic flag with the words freedom, justice, and equality beneath, alongside an American flag with the words Christianity, slavery, suffering, and death. Men and women sat separately. There were typically no hymns, only an occasional soloist singing a nation song, such as one written by Lois X, later Lois Farrakhan. A white man's heaven is the black man's hell. It's an interesting framing. Also, I find it very fascinating that this framing of Christianity is an interesting framing because, from our perspective and from like historical facts point of view, you cannot say that the abolitionist movement is, non-Christian. Like the freedom of the slaves was done largely through Christian auspices. At least one interpretation, even if it was a fringe interpretation, even you could say all the things, but it was still largely done using Christian moral language. Like, am I not a brother and a man, as the Uncle Tom, the book Uncle Tom, supposedly said. Or was it that Uncle Tom? I can't remember if it was Frederick Douglass or not. Anyway, that's just a famous quote that sticks in my mind. And it's also very interesting as well that this turn towards Islam doesn't make any sense either, because the Arabs and the Islamists like enslaved the black population like they enslaved a lot of other population groups. So to say that, and of course their treatment under Islamic slavery under Arabs, like Dominion, probably was worse because they just castrated all of the men, and Christians didn't do that. So which one? There was no possible slave rebellion under Islam, at least from my perspective, because they're all eunuchs in the first place, or they just die off eventually. They don't make babies. Very interesting framing. But of course, in their mind, Christianity is a white man's religion. So, like, that obviously makes sense from that angle. Malcolm's fame grew when he took command of Harlem's 116th Street Mosque No. 7 in 1954. A whirlwind in a camel hair overcoat, he spent hours on stepladders outside the Broadway Bar, the African National Memorial Bookstore, and the Optimal Cigar Store, repeating his personal story of petty crime and drug abuse, outlining the nation's path toward redemption, prophesying the apocalypse, and denouncing white America as a racist, doomed land. The congressman who ran Harlem, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., recognized his talent and invited him to speak at the landmark Abyssinian Baptist Church. Elijah Muhammad saw it too, and named Malcolm as his personal representative in 1957. Malcolm, in turn, put the black Muslims on the map, building bridges to black newspapers and black intellectuals such as novelist James Baldwin and the actor Ossie Davis. He began writing a syndicated column called God's Angry Men. The incident that made Malcolm a Harlem legend occurred in April 1957, when a black Muslim named Johnson X. Hinton interrupted the police beating of a black man and was himself beaten, handcuffed, and taken to the 28th Precinct House. A crowd of 2,000 gathered outside the station. A newspaperman summoned Malcolm in hopes he could stop a riot in the making. As a row of sharply dressed members of the Fruit of Islam lined up outside the station, Malcolm was allowed to inspect Johnson's wounds. Johnson was badly hurt and taken to a hospital. With a single whispered word to an aide, Malcolm then dispersed the angry crowd. That, one police official was overheard to mutter, is too much power for one man to have. I mean, yes, you can see one reason why Malcolm X eventually end up dying a violent death. I mean, this and similar incidents drew hundreds of young blacks into the Nation of Islam at a time when black nationalism, a growing sense of black pride, was taking hold in Harlem, the cultural capital of black America. The rise of Malcolm and the Nation of Islam, in fact, paralleled the gradual radicalization of many northern black elites, especially in Harlem. The avenues above 125th Street had long been home to writers and artists inclined to leftist and even communist causes. In the late 1950s, lacking sources of inspiration in the United States, they began looking overseas. Black pride, as well as a developing sense of African heritage, was stoked by the birth of post-colonial African states and their new black leaders, especially Ghana's radical, US-educated Kwame Nkrumah, whose 1958 open car tour of Harlem drew cheering crowds. The Cuban Revolution, bringing with it Castro's rise to power, along with his outspoken support of the US civil rights movement, was wildly popular in Harlem. Dozens of black intellectuals, from Baldwin to Julian Mayfield, joined the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Even before his exile, Robert Williams visited Cuba and toured the streets of Havana, a straw hat on his head and a pistol strapped to his hip. The Cuban leader's popularity among blacks soared after his visit to Harlem in September 1960. The first black leader he met was Malcolm, who afterward termed Castro the only white person I ever liked. Malcolm, Robert Williams, and the Cuban Revolution helped create a new generation of black nationalists who studied local organizing, the politics of armed self-defense, and global upheavals with equal fervor. Peniel E. Joseph writes in his History of Black Militancy, Waiting Till the Midnight Hour. But it was the 1961 assassination of Congo leader Patrice Lumumba that transformed them into radicals. Coming 4 months after Castro's visit, Lumumba's death at the hands of a white Belgian firing squad prompted unprecedented outrage among New York's new black nationalists. Harlem's Amsterdam News termed it an international lynching, carried out on the altar of white supremacy. On February 15, 1961, crowds of angry black nationalists stormed the United Nations, igniting melees with guards and days of protests. One group of demonstrators told reporters that Negroes were henceforth to be called Afro-Americans. Who died for the black man? Someone yelled. Lumumba. Who died for freedom? Lumumba. This was something altogether new in America. The image of furious northern blacks standing in sharp contrast to their stoic southern brethren marching behind Martin Luther King. Malcolm rode this wave of discontent to national prominence, earning profiles and interviews in Life and the New York Times, in which he unleashed verbal thunderbolts like a vengeful Zeus. He attacked moderate black leaders as race traitors, excoriating King as a chump, not a champ, and the baseball great Jackie Robinson as an Uncle Tom. As violence spread in the South, the assassination of Medgar Evers in 1963, fire hoses, and snapping dogs in Birmingham, Malcolm's rhetoric grew steadily more violent, climaxing in perhaps his best-known speech, delivered to a group of black leaders in Detroit in November 1963. It was there, drawing the distinction between moderates and militants, that he famously conjured the image of two types of slaves: docile house Negroes, who cared for their sick white masters, and hardened field Negroes, who wished them dead. In doing so, he foresaw the only logical conclusion to any campaign for black equality in America: a revolution, a violent revolution. He proclaimed, "You don't have a peaceful revolution. You don't have a turn the other cheek revolution. There's no such thing as a nonviolent revolution. Revolution is bloody. Revolution is hostile. Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way. And you, sitting around here like a knot on the wall, saying, I'm going to love these folks no matter how much they hate me. No, you need a revolution. Whoever heard of a revolution where they lock arms, singing, We shall overcome? You don't do that in a revolution. You don't do any singing, you're too busy swinging. Malcolm's image of a bloody revolution galvanized a generation of black militants and set the stage for riots that would erupt in American ghettos for the rest of the decade. But he also sowed the seeds of his own demise. Open talk of black on white violence, of course, horrified whites and frightened many blacks. But it also elevated Malcolm to a position as black militancy's most infamous proponent. And this did not sit well with his mentor, Elijah Muhammad, who reserved such influence for himself. Even before the Detroit speech, Muhammad had tried to rein Malcolm in. When a Los Angeles Muslim named Ronald Stokes was killed by police in 1962, Malcolm called for black Muslims everywhere to retaliate, invoking the long-foreseen War of Armageddon. Muhammad called it off, embarrassing Malcolm. The turning point came 3 weeks after the Detroit speech, when reporters asked Malcolm what he thought of President Kennedy's assassination 9 days earlier. He replied that, chickens coming home to roost never make me sad, they make me glad. This was too much for Muhammad, who had forbidden public criticism of Kennedy. Amid widespread shock, he suspended Malcolm for 3 months. Malcolm spent the time touring the United States with his newest acolyte, the prize-fighter Cassius Clay. Afterwards, on March 8, 1964, Malcolm announced he was quitting the nation to form a new group, the Organization of Afro-American Unity. It was the beginning of the end. Malcolm spent much of the next year overseas, on a pilgrimage to Mecca and a tour of African and European capitals. In his absence, Harlem exploded in 10 days of riots after an off-duty police officer killed a 15-year-old black boy. Helmeted police fired into crowds of angry blacks, who responded by throwing rocks and burning cars. Black nationalists who led the riots wasted no time placing the violence squarely in the context of Malcolm's new idea of a bloody revolution. There is only one thing that can correct the situation, one told a crowd, and that's guerrilla warfare. All they needed to do to set New York ablaze, he went on, was 100 skilled revolutionaries who are ready to die. Such comments, however, went all but unnoticed in the white press. Of course they did. Of course they did. What no one realized was that the first to die would be Malcolm himself. During his travels, tensions with the nation escalated into death threats. Muhammad himself told Louis Farrakhan that hypocrites like Malcolm should have their heads cut off. An issue of the nation's newspaper, Muhammad Speaks, actually carried a cartoon showing Malcolm's severed head bouncing free of his body. The end was all but preordained. On February 21st, 1965, just days after Malcolm returned from Europe, he was about to address a nationalist meeting in Harlem when he was rushed by several black Muslims. They opened fire with pistols and a sawed-off shotgun. He was dead within minutes, his body riven by 21 gunshot wounds. Malcolm's death, however, did little to stop his message. If anything, his popularity grew. 30,000 people attended a viewing of his body. His posthumous book, The Autobiography of Malcolm X, became mandatory reading for every budding black radical. After Malcolm, the mantle of black militancy was passed to a newcomer on the national scene, a tall, slender, 24-year-old named Stokely Carmichael, a composed, natural leader and gifted orator whose voice carried a hint of his Trinidadian birth. Carmichael emerged in the mid-1960s as a kind of Malcolm of the South. He was so charismatic that friends jokingly called him Stokely Starmichael. At the height of his influence, Ebony wrote that he walks like Sidney Poitier, talks like Harry Belafonte, and thinks like the post-Muslim Malcolm X. I'm seeing an F in the chat. Is my stream still live? Looks like we're still live. Or are you giving Fs in the chat for Malcolm X there, Corbin? Carmichael was raised in the Bronx, and in 1964, he graduated from Howard University to become a full-time organizer for an emerging outfit called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, known as SNCC. SNCC was formed in the wake of the 1960 Greensboro sit-ins and, until Carmichael's rise, quietly went about registering black voters in the South's most dangerous corners. From the beginning, SNCC attracted angry, erudite young blacks, including many northern black nationalists, many of whom had little patience for King's plodding marches and lofty speeches. They wanted action. Now. Heavily influenced by Malcolm's teachings, Carmichael was further radicalized as a SNCC coordinator during 1964's Freedom Summer voter registration drive in Mississippi, watching blacks being beaten during a riot in Montgomery, Alabama. The following year, he suffered a breakdown followed by an epiphany. "I knew I could never be hit again," he recalled, without hitting back. Afterward, Carmichael began charting an entirely new course for SNCC. Oh, good. Okay, we're still live. Marches and riots might provide an emotional release, he reasoned, but the surest path to political power was the voting booth. He studied a single Alabama county, Lowndes, known as Bloody Lowndes for the violence directed against black organizers there, and saw that blacks outnumbered whites by a 4-to-1 margin. Yet only 2 black voters were registered in the entire county. What if, Carmichael reasoned, they registered enough blacks to elect black people to office? It's interesting, just to pause here, noting that even though these people are quite radical and quite violent and have no problem with violence, in fact, they seem to relish violence and they think violence is a necessity, they're still registering people to vote. They're still like believing in the democracy, basically. Lowndes County became an unlikely testing ground for new concepts of black militancy. SNCC formed a political party, the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, and fatefully chose its symbol, a coiled panther. The party became known in the press as the Black Panther Party, a name that would in time inspire thousands of young blacks across the country. Taking a page from black nationalism, SNCC held classes for first-time voters in African history and literacy, played tapes of Malcolm's speeches, and produced pamphlets explaining the political system and how to cast a vote. "It's very simple," Carmichael told a reporter. "We intend to take over Lowndes County." They didn't. All 7 black candidates for office were defeated, thanks largely to ballot stuffing tactics widely decried as illegal. It didn't matter. Carmichael and SNCC had set an example of how blacks could earn political power within the system that would inspire a generation of young black leaders. "Candidates lose," read the headline in SNCC's newsletter, "but Black Panther strong." I mean, it's a very cope answer, to be honest. And of course, ballot stuffing tactics. I mean, where have we seen that before? Ballot stuffing, preventing change through the legitimate political process. I mean, that's nothing we haven't seen at all. By the summer of 1966, Carmichael and his SNCC followers were growing increasingly militant. Their emulation of Malcolm drove a wedge between Carmichael and moderate black leaders like King and the NAACP's Roy Wilkins. The brewing clash of ideologies came to a head during that summer's major civil rights event. a march from Memphis to Jackson, Mississippi. It had begun on June 5th as a one-man effort by activist James Meredith, the first black man to attend the University of Mississippi, when he was shot and wounded by a white supremacist. Carmichael, King, and other leaders amassed hordes of marchers in Mississippi to finish what he had started. Tensions between the King and Carmichael camps were evident from the outset. While King wanted another Selma, a moment when whites could join blacks in calling for black voters to register, Carmichael argued successfully that whites should be excluded altogether. For security, he brought in the Deacons for Defense, a group of armed Louisiana blacks who followed Robert Williams's philosophy of self-defense. Marching beneath a withering sun, King overheard a SNCC volunteer say, "I'm not for that nonviolent stuff anymore. If one of those damn white Mississippi crackers touches me, I'm gonna knock the hell out of him." Each night, King and Carmichael delivered speeches around their campfires. "I'm not going to beg the white man for anything I deserve," Carmichael said at one. "I'm going to take it." When King's people attempted to sing "We Shall Overcome," Carmichael's troops sang a new version, "We Shall Overrun." The moment that changed everything, when the civil rights movement began to morph into something new and frightening to many Americans, occurred on June 16, 1966, in the town of Greenwood. After he was arrested for pitching a tent at the local high school, Carmichael stormed out of the jail and marched to Broad Street Park, where a crowd waited. He leaped atop a tractor trailer and shot a fist into the air. "This is the 27th time that I've been arrested," he announced, "and I ain't going to jail no more. The only way we gonna stop them white men from whooping us is to take over. We've been saying freedom for 6 years and we ain't got nothing. What we gonna start saying now is black power." "Black power," the crowd roared. Another activist, Willie Ricks, jumped atop the trailer and joined Carmichael. "What do you want?" Ricks hollered. "Black power." "What do we want?" "Black power." Black power. For the first time, the rising tide of black anger had not only a new face in Stokely Carmichael, but a new name: Black Power. Carmichael's speech electrified the nation. The NAACP's Roy Wilkins called the term "the father of hatred and the mother of violence." In a speech the very next night in Greenwood, King himself told his audience, "Some people are telling us to be like our oppressor, who has a history of using Molotov cocktails, who has a history of dropping the atomic bomb, who has a history of lynching Negroes. Now people are telling me to stoop down to that level. I'm sick and tired of violence." But it was too late. The movement of white freedom riders and speeches by Dr. King was ending. In its place, a new movement was taking shape. But exactly what it would look like, no one could say. Carmichael himself, in a television appearance on Face the Nation and in later speeches, struggled to define black power. To him, it appeared to mean a grasp for economic and political power by a movement run by blacks and only for blacks. Yet his use of incendiary language. When you use, quote, "when you use black power, you talk about bringing this nation to its knees," end quote, though only emboldened those whose vision of power meant burning, rioting, and worse. White America certainly had no difficulty defining black power. In a jarring juxtaposition, a Life cover that summer featured a tearful Elizabeth Taylor. In an unrelated story, beneath the headline, "Plot to Get Whitey. Red-hot young Negroes plan a ghetto war." The story, focusing on a fringe militant group inspired by Robert Williams, the Revolutionary Action Movement, known as RAM, noted, "In secret recesses of any ghetto in the U.S., there are dozens and hundreds of black men working resolutely toward an Armageddon in which Whitey is to be either destroyed or forced to his knees." This, at least, was a conservative white interpretation of the black riots that had begun convulsing U.S. cities in 1964. Los Angeles' Watts riot neighborhood had burned in 1965 followed in 1966 by riots in 20 cities, including San Francisco, Oakland, Cleveland, and Omaha. The idea that these riots represented something other than the spontaneous frustrations of impoverished urban blacks, that these could be the first shots of an armed black revolution, came into sharp focus in 1967. The catalyst was a pair of nasty summer riots in Newark and Detroit, in which crowds of enraged blacks ransacked entire city blocks and engaged in street battles with police and hundreds of National Guardsmen. In the flames of Newark, the activist Tom Hayden, like many others in the movement, saw a black rebellion. The actions of white America are showing black people, especially the young, that they must prepare to fight back, he wrote. The conditions slowly are being created for an American form of guerrilla warfare based in the slums. The riot represents a sign of this fundamental change. I mean, where else have we heard this sort of language where, riots being the language of the unheard and all of that? No one could prove that black riots were a product of black power sloganeering, but they certainly pushed violent rhetoric toward new extremes. Carmichael, seeking release from his administrative responsibilities, resigned the chairmanship of SNCC in May 1967 to embark on a speaking tour of Europe and Africa. He was replaced as Black Power's national spokesman by his successor, a fiery 23-year-old militant named H. Rap Brown. While white radicals like Hayden swapped position papers as Detroit and Newark burned, Brown not only foresaw the spread of violence, he demanded it. During a July riot in the town of Cambridge on Maryland's eastern shore, he mounted the hood of a car and, in a rambling 45-minute speech, used the most explicit language yet in calling for the overthrow of white America. This ain't no riot, brother, Brown declared. This is a rebellion, and we got 400 years of reasons to tear this town apart. You don't have to be a big group to do it, brothers. In a town this size, 3 men can burn it down. That's what they call guerrilla warfare. Brown's remarks, scribbled down by a New York Times reporter, went beyond calls for burning the white man's stores. Don't love him to death, shoot him to death, Brown told the wildly cheering crowd. You better get yourself some guns. I know who my enemy is, and I know how to kill him. When I get mad, I'm going out and sorry, the grammar. When I get mad, I'm going out and look for a honky, and I'm going to take out 400 years worth of dues on him. I mean, this whole narrative of 400 years of slavery, I mean, this is exactly why we, and I've heard this argument many times before at this point, that of why you can't get any sort of like political concessions from the system. Oh, well, why can't we have like economic equality? Why is it still permissible for affirmative action reasons? And the answer that you get, especially from white liberals or white leftists, is always 400 years. 400 years. The problem is when does this sort of guilt complex have an expiration date? And guilt inevitably does seem to have an expiration date. Unfortunately, I'm of the opinion that it seems to expire once you have victimization placed back upon you, and then you get to claim some kind of victim status. I think that's very unfortunate. It's retarded. It's really stupid, but that just seems to be how herd psychology seems to work. I much prefer to be more like a Jonathan Bowden figure and reject the claims of guilt and say we will not apologize. All right, next paragraph. The incident thrust Rap Brown into the national spotlight. All that summer, in speeches from New Jersey to Texas, he escalated his calls for blacks to wage guerrilla war on the honky white man, as he put it to an audience in Jersey City. Violence is necessary. It is as American as cherry pie, he told a boisterous crowd outside a Washington, D.C. church on July 27th. Black people have been looting. I say there should be more shooting than looting, so if you loot, loot a gun store. In a speech in Queens, New York on August 6th, Brown called the Detroit and Newark riots a dress rehearsal for revolution. And warned President Lyndon Johnson, whom he termed the greatest outlaw in history, that if you play Nazis with us, we ain't gonna play Jews. This is 20 years after the Second World War ended, so of course they're going to use the 20th century narratives here. This kind of talk by the leader of a nationally recognized group like SNCC was unprecedented, a step beyond anything Carmichael or even Malcolm had dared put into words. It provoked widespread denunciations, congressional investigations, and something approaching horror among black leaders as well as white. For the moment, however, white America could do little to halt the spread of black power. As a rap Brown whipped black crowds into a frenzy, Stokely Carmichael took the angry word farther afield, introducing black power to adoring audiences in Copenhagen, London, Paris, several African capitals, and significantly Havana, as he had with Robert Williams, and would do to scores of white and black radicals in the years to come. Fidel Castro greeted Carmichael with open arms. Carmichael, in turn, met with guerrilla leaders from across the Third World, and, placing Black Power's struggle in an international context, pledged solidarity with revolutionary movements from Uruguay to South Africa. When he returned to New York's Kennedy Airport on December 11th, he received a hero's welcome. A crowd raised clenched fists and chanted, "Ungawa! Black Power!" By then, however, Carmichael's power, if not his visibility, was waning. Riven by internal disputes, SNCC was crumbling. The movement was surging beyond civil rights towards something darker and more confrontational. Yet still no one had answered this basic question. What was black power? What did it mean on the streets? An answer was on the way, it turned out, and it came clad in sleek black leather jackets, black berets, and cocked shotguns. Within days of his return from abroad, Carmichael met in Washington with members of a new group who would translate the bold words of black power into organization and action, transforming the nascent revolutionary movement and setting the stage for the underground groups to come. They called themselves Black Panthers. Stokely Carmichael's work in Lowndes County had actually spawned a dozen or more tiny black power groups who could call themselves Black Panthers in New York, St. Louis, San Francisco, and other northern cities. But only one of these would become the Black Panthers. This was the one that formed around a pair of Oakland College students, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, who founded their Black Panther Party for self-defense 4 months after Carmichael's Greenwood speech in October 1966. Like many they would attract in 1967 and 1968, Newton and Seale were working-class Southern transplants. The seventh child of a minister and a housewife, Newton had come from Louisiana as a boy, and Seale had come from Dallas. Newton, silkily handsome, thin-skinned, intellectual, a tortured soul, was the thinker, the visionary. Seale, 6 years older, served as the governor on Newton's fiery engine. They became friends at Oakland's Merritt College, where Newton paid his tuition in part by burglarizing homes. That's just ridiculous. Come on. He's a scholar. Yeah. Ridiculous. Seale, following a dishonorable discharge from the Air Force, had joined the Robert Williams-inspired Revolutionary Action Movement. He met Newton at Merritt's Afro-American Association. Both were smitten by the entire canon of revolutionary literature circa 1966, especially Negroes with Guns, Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, and anything written by Che Guevara. Yeah, Frantz Fanon. Yeah. They read everything Mal wrote, but their idol was Malcolm, whose every word they treated as scripture. Newton later called the Panthers a living testament to Malcolm's life work. As the thrill of Black power swept Black colleges and ghettos in the fall of 1966, the two decided to form a local group to protest police brutality and mount armed patrols to monitor police in Black neighborhoods, as a group in Watts was doing. They pitched the idea to Merritt's sole Student Advisory Council, which rejected it as impractical. When Seale took it to his Ram friends, they were even more emphatic. They called him suicidal. And so, that fall, Newton and Seale sat down in the offices of the North Oakland Service Center and, engulfed by books and pamphlets issued by RAM, the Nation of Islam, and half a dozen other militant groups, devised a program of their own. Newton dictated, Seale transcribed. The result was the Panthers' famous 10-point program. Some of these points were practical, some not. They demanded full employment, good housing and education, an end to police brutality, and freedom, but also the exemption of Blacks from military service and the release of all Blacks in every jail and prison. Before they had a single recruit, Newton named himself the party's leader, its Minister of Defense. Minister of Defense, what an ostentatious title for a radical group. While Seale became the chairman, the number 2. Okay, interesting. So you can see this is a visionary and XO, basically, or executive officer. This is this sort of organization. And these two figures, Newton and Seale, seem to be basically doing that based off of their personality descriptions, is that Newton's the visionary and Seale is the guy who gets things done. Few protest groups in U.S. history have risen to national prominence as quickly as the Panthers. They went from an idea in Huey Newton's head to the front pages of major newspapers in a scant 7 months. Part of this was luck, part the enormous appeal to a beleaguered urban Blacks of the Panthers' message to police. Kill a Black man, they warned, and retribution will follow. But the crucial factor in the Panthers' meteoric rise was Newton's genius for media and street theatrics, as demonstrated from their first confrontations with authority to the costumes they donned: black leather jackets, powder blue shirts and turtlenecks, and especially the black berets they wore in honor of Che Guevara. Unlike other Black militant groups springing up that year, the Panthers not only sounded badass, they looked it. That's so important, is actually looking the part, or being perceived to play the part. It's all about authenticity with these things. That's what it is. In its first 100 days, the party consisted only of Newton, Seale, and a dozen or so of their friends. With little fanfare, they secured their first guns, learned how to use and clean them, opened a storefront office at 56th and Grove in Oakland, and began their patrols, cruising the streets until they found a Black citizen being questioned by police, typically at a traffic stop. The Panthers would step from their car, guns drawn, and remind the citizen of his rights. When a shaken patrolman asked what the hell they were doing, Newton, who had taken law school classes, told him of their right to bear arms. The Panthers generated curiosity, and then, after a tense confrontation outside their office in early February 1967, respect. An Oakland policeman stopped Newton's car. Seale and others were with him. At first, Newton politely showed his driver's license and answered the officer's questions. He had his M1 rifle in clear view, Seale, his 9mm. In short order, 3 more patrol cars arrived. A crowd began to form. Up and down the street, people poked their heads from apartment windows. When an officer asked to see the guns, Newton refused. "Get away from the car," Newton said. "We don't want you around the car, and that's all there is to it." "Who in the hell do you think you are?" the officer demanded. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" Newton replied. At that point, Newton emerged from the car and loudly chambered around in his rifle. When police tried to shoo away the growing crowd, Newton shouted for everyone to stay put, that they were within their rights to observe what was happening on a public street. What are you going to do with that gun? The officer asked. What are you going to do with your gun? Newton replied. Because if you shoot at me, or if you try to take this gun, I'm going to shoot back at you, swine. The byplay continued like this for several minutes. Each time Newton challenged the police, onlookers would clap and yell, "You know where it's at," or "Dig it." Newton, it was clear, was acting out the fantasy of every black youth on the street. And amazingly, he got away with it. The police retired without making any arrests. I mean, it shows you how powerless these people actually are. You know, you can't emphasize enough how this actually looks, right? It looks like the cops are powerless and the black radicals are, powerful. It looks like, oh, well, you're not just squashing them immediately. Sip. I mean, as is tradition for my streams, I always have a cup of tea next to me. Or some drink, anyway. Usually tea, though. Usually tea or water. Or coffee. Within days, word of these brazen new Panthers spread from Oakland across the Bay Area. The turning point came on February 21st, 1967. Another of the new Panther groups, this one based in San Francisco, had invited Malcolm's widow, Betty Shabazz. Shabazz? What a completely ridiculous name, like Shabazz. Okay, so where was I? Another of the new Panther groups, this one based in San Francisco, had invited Malcolm's widow, Betty Shabazz, to announce the formation of a Bay Area chapter of Malcolm's OAAU on the anniversary of his death. Because the San Francisco Panthers disdained weaponry, they'd invited the Oakland Panthers to provide security. Newton, Seal, and their new recruits, all armed, escorted Shabazz from the airport to offices of the radical magazine Ramparts, where she gave an interview. They emerged afterward into a phalanx of newsmen, papermen, television cameras, and police. Shabazz had asked that her picture not be taken. When one photographer refused to lower his camera, Newton punched him. Several policemen raised their guns. When a few Panthers turned their back to watch Shabazz emerge from the building, Newton snapped. "Don't turn your back on these back-shooting motherfuckers." He chambered a round into a shotgun. A crowd conformed. Both Ramparts editors and policemen raised their hands and told everyone to cool it. But when one officer refused, Newton barked, "Don't point that gun at me." When the officer still refused, he shouted, "Okay, you big, fat, racist pig. Draw your gun. Draw it, you cowardly dog. I'm waiting." The officer lowered his weapon, diffusing the situation. But the incident was caught on television cameras and made a powerful impact when it aired. This was something entirely new to California, and soon to the rest of the country. Strong, proud, black men with guns facing down startled white policemen. This, it appeared, was what black power would mean in the streets. Word of Huey Newton and these fearless new Black Panthers spread like a windswept fog. In the next few weeks, the party attracted hundreds of new recruits, some of them gang members and ex-convicts. Newton made clear that the Panthers wanted the toughest, most badass street fighters he could find, and he got them.
There is no point in having a good outfit if you don't.
Fucking YouTube ads. None were more important than a tall, languid ex-con who studied Newton's bit of leather on the sidewalk that day outside the Ramparts office, where he worked. His name was Eldridge Cleaver, and his destiny would be to become Huey Newton's single most valuable partner, and, later, his worst nightmare. Cleaver's legacy would be the destruction of the Black Panther Party, but he was even more pivotal to what came after, to the underground movement of the 1970s. He became Black Power's fourth great voice, the oratorical bridge between open defiance of American authority and urban guerrilla warfare. Not only would he emerge as the guiding force behind the Black Liberation Army, but having forged alliances between Black convicts and white Bay Area radicals, he created the intellectual framework for what became the Symbionese Liberation Army. There was no Black voice, before or since, quite like Cleaver's. Born in rural Arkansas in 1935, he moved with his family to Phoenix and then to Watts, where as a teenager he fell into a life of drugs and petty theft. He spent much of the 1950s shuttling between reform schools and California prisons, eventually, in 1957, graduating to rape. Years later, in a series of essays that paved the way for the white radical deification of hardened Black prison inmates, he described his rape of white women as his first revolutionary act. He wrote, "To refine my technique, I started out by practicing on Black girls in the ghetto. In the Black ghetto, where dark and vicious deeds appear not as aberrations or deviations from the norm, but as part of the sufficiency of the evil of the day." And when I considered myself pretty smooth enough, I crossed the tracks and sought out white prey. I did this consciously, deliberately, willfully, methodically. Rape was an insurrectionary act. It delighted me that I was defying and trampling upon the white man's law, upon his system of values, and that I was defiling his women.
Smell good, which is why I like to use
Fucking damn it. I'm gonna have to edit that out. And this point, I believe, was the most satisfying to me because I was very resentful over the historical fact of how the white man has used the Black woman. I felt I was getting revenge. Sentenced to prison for rape. Yeah, I know, Corbin. I'm gonna have to edit that out. I'm trying to make gun cocking sounds here, but there's fucking YouTube ads. It's irritating. Sentenced to prison for rape, first at San Quentin and later at Folsom, Cleaver, like Malcolm, read voraciously, joined the Nation of Islam, and became a leader in the state's burgeoning prison movement, pushing for books and classes in African history. In 1965, he wrote a radical Bay Area attorney named Beverly Axelrod who took up his case. He gave some of Cleaver's letters and editors at Ramparts, who enjoyed them so much that they promised to hire him when they did, and as they did, Axelrod managed to secure Cleaver's release. In December 1966, Cleaver, who became Axelrod's lover, said years later that he had been romantically gaming her in a cynical bid to gain his freedom. At Ramparts, Cleaver became an instant celebrity, by far the most prominent Black radical in the Bay Area. Sometimes funny and frequently sexual, his letters and articles portrayed Cleaver as a kind of cross between Malcolm and Barry White, an angry, charismatic lover man with his own revolutionary spin on hoary Black stereotypes. Cleaver viewed Blacks as sexual supermen, envied by whites and too often rejected by uppity Black women. What is this? Just uppity Black women, please. And, like Huey Newton, he argued that the most genuine revolutionaries were those who were most oppressed, Black prison inmates and gangbangers, an idea that appealed strongly to white radicals yearning for a taste of Black authenticity. Unlike Stokely Carmichael, Cleaver embraced white radicals who adored him. They flocked to Black House, a kind of Black Power salon Cleaver co-founded, where he held court with every movement figure who visited San Francisco. Cleaver's rise would be capped in 1968 when his letters and Ramparts articles were packaged into a memoir, Soul on Ice, an international bestseller that sold more than 2 million copies in just 2 years. Critics hailed Cleaver as a powerful new literary talent, a symbol of Black political and sexual repression. The New York Times named Soul on Ice one of the 10 best books of 1968. After the confrontation outside Ramparts, Cleaver signed on as the Panthers' information minister, editor of the party's new weekly newspaper, the Black Panther, and, in the public's mind at least, Newton's intellectual equal. But while the Newton-Cleaver marriage gave the Panthers instant legitimacy in radical circles, it introduced an ideological rift that would eventually split the party. Newton and Seal were using armed self-defense as a recruiting tool, a way to lure members to man the education, welfare, and free breakfast programs the Panthers were putting into place. For all their tough talk, they had no intention of actually hunting policemen. Cleaver did. He wanted the bloody fight Malcolm and Rap Brown foresaw, a genuine revolution, Vietnam-style guerrilla warfare in America. Many found this hard to take seriously, but Cleaver was serious. Once, when asked what he meant when he talked of an army, Cleaver responded, "A black liberation army, an army of angry niggas." With Cleaver on board, the Panthers' profile rose quickly. After a sheriff's deputy killed an unnamed car thief named Denzel Dowell that April, the Panthers announced their own investigation. This outraged a group of state legislators, one of whom swarmed to get the Panthers by introducing a bill to ban the public display of loaded weapons. Newton's dramatic response would make the Panthers a household name. On May 2nd, 1967, Bobby Seale led a team of 24 armed Panthers, clad in black leather and berets, to the California State Capitol building in Sacramento. A news crew on hand for a talk Governor Ronald Reagan was giving to a group of schoolchildren on a nearby lawn began filming. Seale, wearing a .45 on his hip, was stopped by security guards at the top of the Capitol steps. To his left stood a Panther holding a .357 Magnum. To his right was the party's first recruit, a teenager named Bobby Hutton, massaging a 12-gauge shotgun. One of the guards asked another, "Who in the hell are all these niggers with guns?" That's a quote, by the way. "Where in the hell is the assembly?" Seale shouted. "Anybody here know where you go in and observe the assembly making these laws?" When someone yelled that it was upstairs, Seale's group pushed past the guards, ascended a broad staircase, and marched into the packed assembly chamber. Pandemonium ensued. As guards began pushing the Panthers back toward the door, a guard snatched Hutton's shotgun. "Am I under arrest?" Hutton yelled. "What the hell you got my gun for? If I'm not under arrest, you give me my gun back." The Panthers went peacefully. Outside, as reporters crowded around, Seale read a statement, denouncing the proposed gun law and launching into a tirade against racist police agencies throughout the country, intensifying the terror, brutality, repression, murder of black people. This was the Panthers at their most theatrical, and it caused a sensation. Overnight, footage of armed black men boldly roaming the Capitol steps stunned the nation. All that summer, as Newton led the Panthers in demonstrations across the Bay Area, the party was inundated by calls from new recruits. Then came the moment that altered the course of Panther history. Early on the morning of October 28, 1967, Newton, by his own estimate, had already been stopped by police 50 or more times, was flagged down by an Oakland patrol car. A gunfight ensued. Newton walked away with at least one bullet hole in his abdomen. 2 officers were badly wounded. 1 died. When Newton limped into an emergency room, he was arrested. He would not go free for 3 years. The prosecution of Huey Newton would be one of the decade's centerpiece events, providing a rallying cry, "Free Huey," for a generation of black power advocates, drawing hundreds of recruits to the party and mobilizing thousands more to protests. But the impact on the Panthers was ultimately devastating. The absence of both Newton and Bobby Seale, who was serving a 6-month sentence for his role in the confrontation on the Capitol steps, created a leadership vacuum that was filled by Eldridge Cleaver, It was under Cleaver that the Panthers would drastically escalate their language of violence and insurrection to levels never before heard in America. The audacity of this rhetoric, even from a vantage point of 45 years, is shocking. It was the Panther newspaper, the Black Panther, that coined the phrase, "off the pig," under Cleaver. The Panther openly called for the murder of policemen, supplying tips on ambush tactics and ways to build bombs. The only good pig, quipped Michael Setawayo Tabor, a New York Panther, is a dead pig. Setawayo, that sounds very similar to Satesh Wayo, which is a Zulu leader who fought against and I think managed to defeat the British. Or was he defeated by the British? I think one of those. I think he defeated them and then was later basically crushed by British colonial power. But anyway, sounds like that's part of the inspiration for this guy, Setawayo Tabor. The Panther chief of staff, David Hilliard, was arrested after telling a crowd in San Francisco, "We will kill Richard Nixon." When Cleaver ran for president in 1968, he said of the White House, "We will burn the motherfucker down." Another Panther was quoted as saying, "We need black FBI agents to assassinate J. Edgar Hoover. And nigger CIA agents should kidnap the Rockefellers and the Kennedys." Panther rhetoric, in turn, inspired a host of black voices toward new extremes. A young poet, Nikki Giovanni, was among the mainstream black writers attracted to revolutionary themes. She wrote in a 1968 poem, this is not exactly a poem, "Nigger, can you kill? Can you kill? Can a nigger kill? Can a nigger kill a honky? Can you splatter their brains in the street? Can you kill them? Learn to kill niggers. Learn to be black men." Much of this, the author Curtis J. Austin has observed, could be dismissed as ghetto rhetoric. But the FBI, and especially urban police commissioners, could not ignore it, and with good reason. The escalation in black power rhetoric paralleled a rise in attacks on police. Between 1964 and 1967, assaults on Los Angeles patrolmen quintupled. Between 1967 and 1969, attacks on officers in New Jersey leaped by 41%. In Detroit, they rose 70% in 1969 alone. In congressional testimony and press interviews, police officials in cities across the country blamed the rise in violence squarely on the Panthers and their ultraviolet rhetoric. The Panthers drew the FBI's attention early on. In late 1967, agents began bugging party headquarters in Oakland. The first step in an anti-Panther drive that, as shown elsewhere in this book, would grow into an elaborate and illegal campaign of dirty tricks against black power groups, all of it designed to prevent the rise of what J. Edgar Hoover called a black messiah, a single black leader who could unite the disparate voices of black power. Until that messiah rose, Hoover told a Senate committee in 1969, he considered the Panthers the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. And this is oddly reminiscent now that you have figures in current intelligence agencies calling white supremacy as the greatest internal threat to security in the United States. The wheel turns. History repeats itself, or at least rhymes, anyway. Moving on. In early 1968, the rise in Panther rhetoric led to heightened tensions with Bay Area police, especially in Oakland. The police launched scores of raids on Panther homes, briefly arresting Cleaver and Seal, and rumors flew that the police were plotting to wipe out the Panthers. Then, on April 4th, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. In Washington, D.C., Stokely Carmichael, now aligned with the Panthers, announced that white America had declared war on blacks. Riots broke out in more than 120 cities. In Oakland, 2 days later, Cleaver and a group of Panthers jumped into 3 cars and went looking for police to kill. They stopped at an intersection in West Oakland, Cleaver recalled years later, because he needed to take a piss real badly. An Oakland police patrolman pulled up behind. Everybody all day was talking about some action, Cleaver recalled. So we put together a little series of events to take place the next night, where we basically went out to ambush the cops. But it was an aborted ambush because the cops showed up too soon. When the patrol car pulled up, Cleaver said, the Panthers got out and started shooting. That's what happened. People scattered and ran every which way. Yeah, you're not wrong there, Corbin. The intelligence agencies and Fuentes, among others, these are very interesting tactics and rhetoric that we see being played out again. We're almost done with this chapter, by the way. We have about another page or so. Cleaver and a young Bobby Hutton took refuge in the basement of a nearby home, where they engaged police in a 90-minute gunfight. When the police used tear gas, Cleaver emerged shirtless to show he was unarmed, alongside Hutton. Officers began shoving and kicking Hutton. When he stumbled, shots rang out. Hutton, hit at least 6 times, was killed. He became a martyr. Cleaver, granted bail, became a hero. It was King's death and the image of brave Panthers seeking to avenge it that cemented the party's national reputation. For the first time, many blacks who had resisted the martial calls of black power began to believe that white violence must be met with black violence. Emissaries arrived in Oakland from New York and dozens of other cities, all clamoring to start their own Panther chapters. In a matter of months, party membership went from hundreds to thousands. By late 1968, there would be Panther chapters in almost every major urban area. From a managerial point of view, it was chaos. A central committee was supposed to impose some kind of structure, but for the moment, Panther headquarters exercised little sway over these new affiliates. It was, in some respects, the apex of the party's influence. Looking back, there is no denying that the Panthers' heroic age was already passing. In September, after a 2-month trial marked by rancorous demonstrations, Huey Newton was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 2 to 15 years. Bobby Seale was indicted for taking part in demonstrations at the Democratic National Convention that August, becoming one of the Chicago Eight. Eldridge Cleaver, released on bond after the April shootout, spent the rest of 1968 campaigning for president and promoting Soul on Ice. After refusing to appear for a court date on November 27, he vanished. Some said he had fled to Canada, others to Cuba. The next month, a weary Stokely Carmichael boarded a freighter for a self-imposed exile in Guinea. The revolution is not about dying, he observed. It's about living. In the absence of its best-known leaders, the party was ostensibly run by Newton's childhood friend and chief of staff, David Hilliard. But Hilliard was a weak leader, crass and profane, and by early 1968 the chapters were growing increasingly autonomous, straining ties between Oakland and the larger East Coast outposts, especially the ultra-militant New York chapter. Beset by police informers, Hilliard initiated a nationwide purge of suspect members, forbidding new inmates and further alienating not only his subordinates, but the Panthers' radical white allies. The new Nixon administration's all-out war on the party led to mass arrests of Panthers in New York in April and May 1969, and in New Haven that May. By the summer of 1969, the party was spiraling toward anarchy, which is exactly when a crucial group of Panthers' white allies mounted a kind of rescue operation. These were not just any allies. They were the creme de la creme, the national leadership of the dominant white movement organization, Students for a Democratic Society, known as SDS. They called themselves Weathermen. And with that, that is the end of chapter 2. Very interesting, this response by Carmichael once it gets too hot. You can tell with any sort of these changes, right? They always have the depth of a radical social movement to keep these things going. once it gets too hot, or inevitably people end up going to prison, and individual splinter groups of these kinds of guerrilla cells, they always get infiltrated or tracked down by the FBI or what have you. They always break off. Some people go into exile. They cool off. They spend like a period cooling off in exile. And then and then you have obviously the entrance into new groups to carry on the struggle, basically. So it's not really about like the demoralization of losing a certain group to regime action isn't really something that any sort of radical movement necessarily seems to be concerned with. The concern is, do you have the depth of recruitment, and do you have the broad base of support, basically, and the broad base of radicalization, which that's already stuff that's been like preceded, right? This was all of these things, as we'll get to with the Weathermen, were all seeded beforehand, 15 to 20 years beforehand. And now all of these people are growing up on radical literature, they're reading Mao, etc. So all of that, the groundwork for this has already been long done. So it's always about maintaining the struggle for as long as possible in order to get as many changes as you possibly can get while the iron is hot, basically. That seems to me to be the way that these movements effectively are able to get the things that they want out of politics. And that's basically, to just it's not you don't win against a liberal democracy, right? You exhaust it, basically, is my point that I'm trying to make. There's a famous quote from if you can find it, used to be on YouTube, but I haven't been able to find it in several years now, but it's from the Danish television series called 1864. It's a joint Danish and German series. And basically there's this famous quote, who is it? Von Wrangel is the guy, and he's basically sitting in a tent, pounding his fist into the beat of the Yorkshire March, and he is basically getting shit canned by I can't remember the name now, by von Moltke the Elder, and because he's basically just too old and he can't do his job, or at least that's the way that the show portrays it. And he has this wonderful quote where he's like, "I fought Napoleon, right? I was there. I fought Napoleon. You don't defeat Napoleon. You exhaust him." Is this wonderful quote, and I thought that was a very interesting quote because that's how any sort of movement that desires political change basically has to engage with the political system. You're never going to be able to defeat it. You're just there to be annoying enough and for long enough that the system eventually gives it up and quits and says, all right, well, this is just we either just squash these people outright, and if you can't do that for one reason or another, you eventually have to give in, basically. And that's what all of these little movements understand. But with that is the end of chapter 2, Negroes with Guns. The next part, so this is actually, up until now, has been all prologue, technically. Now we're actually getting into part 1, if you can believe it, which is the story arc of the Weathermen, and that is the emergence and the actual beginnings of the movement of the Weathermen terrorist group. So anyway, hopefully tomorrow, if I am free, I will be able to get to that. If not, probably later this week. So do expect that. And this is an interesting book and an interesting series, and I'm very glad that I could bring this to the world through audio format. So thanks, everybody. I will bid you a very good rest of your evening, morning, whatever it is. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.